You're listening to episode 58 of Literacy in Color. In today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Jane Ashby, who's listed as the first author of a free resource entitled Teaching Phonemic Awareness in 2024, a guide for educators. It was developed alongside well-respected names like Louisa Moats and Lucy Hart-Paulson. Dr. Ashby's reading journey started 30 years ago, where she pursued a degree at Harvard Graduate School of Education and then taught adult learners who struggled with reading. Over the years, she's deepened her expertise through Orton Gillingham training, supporting students with reading disorders, and even earning her doctorate in psychology, where she studied how readers recognize words during silent reading. She has since co-authored The Psychology of Reading, as well as several papers examining the role of phonology in silent reading, and has even led an eye movement research lab investigating the role of speech processes in silent reading. She now serves as a professor of the Reading Science doctoral program at Mount St. Joseph University. In this conversation, Dr. Ashby will walk us through the Phonemic Awareness Guide and address a lot of the big questions that we are hearing in the field around phonemic awareness today. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. Today, we're going to be chatting about phonemic awareness. And in recent years, there has been quite a buzz around phonemic awareness between blog posts and social media and even recent meta-analyses out there. Teachers are asking really important questions to inform their craft. Things like, is mastery of larger chunk units necessary before working at the phoneme level? Should we teach phonemic awareness with or without letters? How much phonemic awareness instruction really is necessary? Which students need it the most? And which tasks are most important? So to help tackle some of these questions, there is a free resource out there circulating online entitled Teaching Phonemic Awareness in 2024, a guide for educators, and it's been authored and reviewed by some of the most well-respected and well-renowned voices in literacy, including Dr. Louisa Moats and Lucy Hart-Paulson, the authors of Letters and Letters EC, respectively. And today we're going to go straight to the source by talking to the first author of this guide, Dr. Jane Ashby. And Dr. Ashby is a professor and a researcher and longtime advocate for evidence-based reading instruction. So she's going to help us address some of these topics around phonemic awareness, what it is, why it matters, and best practices for teaching it, and how we can interpret some of the research around this topic. So first of all, welcome to the show, Dr. Ashby.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm so looking forward to our conversation today.
I am as well. So this guide, Teaching Phonemic Awareness in 2024, it was created by this powerhouse team of educators, as you know, and it also has several notable reviewers in the field as well. What was your shared goal in putting this free resource out there for educators?
So the goal was to create a freely available document that presented a consensus opinion among all of the authors, which come from very different perspectives. So we have professional learning leaders like Louisa Moats and Lucy Hart-Paulson. Probably many of your listeners don't know that I was a reading educator for a decade, working in adult education and also working with learning disabled children. And then we have other people who bring expertise in speech-language pathology, expertise in English as a second language, etc. So we wanted to have a guide that filled in some of the gaps that might be present in some other programs and instructional manuals.
That's really helpful. And it's a really nice, thorough, concise read that addresses a lot of these big questions and even gives really practical strategies for instructional use, which is really helpful. To help ground us in our conversation today, perhaps we can start by just defining phonemic awareness and how it differs from our other pillars of literacy.
Right. So the definition in the literature of phonemic awareness is that phonemic awareness is the ability to identify, isolate, and manipulate speech sounds. So note that there is no definition in the literature of phonemic awareness that includes letters. So phonemic awareness is this thing that is a reflection of processing within the language system, particularly within the speech system. And so it differs from the other 5 pillars in the sense that it exists independently of reading to a degree. Typically, illiterate adults do not have phonemic awareness at the phoneme level, which suggests that there is this bidirectional relationship that phonemic awareness improves reading, and as reading improves, it also enhances phonemic awareness at the phoneme level. Phonemic awareness and vocabulary differ from the other pillars because these are properties of the language system that exist independent of print. PA is one of the strongest early predictors of reading and typical reading development. And as students learn more, they continue to build more fine-grained awareness of the complex sequence of sounds, and that continues to boost their reading and spelling.
That's a really helpful distinction. And we know that when we're talking about the sound units, a lot of times in recent conversations, people are using the terms phonemic awareness and phonics interchangeably or identifying phonemic awareness as phonics instruction. So to ground us in remembering that it is about these streams of sound, I think is really important distinction to have. So when we're thinking about assessing phonemic awareness for our students, what are perhaps some of the most practical ways that classroom teachers can go about figuring out if their students have phonemic awareness skills or if they don't?
Are we talking kindergarten and first grade, or are we talking older students?
Yeah, let's start with our emergent readers.
Okay, so the National Reading Panel report recommends teaching essential or basic level phonemic awareness to all students simply because our reading diagnostics and our screeners might not be sensitive enough. It looks like we're detecting about 80% of the kids who are at risk, but we're missing a chunk of them. So it's kind of inoculation approach. It's something that's good for all kids in small amounts and of course followed up with small group. So if you have a student, let's just say you're a teacher who is using a program in your classroom, like let's say it's Haggerty, and you notice that there's always that kid, when the other ones have their thumb up, that kid has their thumb down, or that kid is looking around to their neighbors to see what their response is. So that's a student that you might want to pull aside and do a quick one-on-one diagnostic with. So the existing phonemic awareness diagnostic that I recommend right now is the Rosner, which has been around for a long time. It's 13 items. It's a deletion task, and it starts at the syllable level and then moves to deleting parts of initial blends. So 13 items, it takes like under a minute, and it's very easy to see the level that your student gets stuck at. So for example, let's say your student is getting stuck at breaking the first sound off of 3 sound words. So say sit, say it again without the s, and the student says cat. So then what you would do is you wouldn't start with the deletion task. You would start with blending and segmenting 3 sound words, emphasizing the first sound. Maybe you would do categorization of a bunch of pictures that all start with the same first sound and then a few in there that don't. So they look at the picture, they say the word, and they put it in the pile. So they start attending to the first sounds in words. And once they can blend and segment those 2 parts, the first sound and the rest of the word, then you can move to teaching them the deletion task.
That's helpful. And so essentially, phonemic awareness is the recommendation put forth by the reading panel in K1. And then, so what you're saying is if you're noticing just by observational data, if students are having any issues or deficits, to pull that for a diagnostic to gain some more information and make some more targeted instructional choices to address those needs specifically, correct?
Exactly.
Wonderful. And so when you talk about the Rosner and some of those deletion tasks, is there any research supporting that type of assessment?
That is a great question. Research is very important, and validation studies and norming studies are very important for instruments that provide standard scores. Things like the CTOP or the WISC or the Wyatt require a lot of research to validate them. Screeners and progress monitoring instruments require a lot of research because you're trying to figure out where a child is relative to their peers. Diagnostic instruments, which is what the Rosner is, are very much skill-based. So the idea is it has items that tap a certain skill, and if the student can perform those items, then we don't need to teach it. It's much more straightforward. So it's limited in the sense that it doesn't let us compare the student that's in front of us with other students. But it is simply looking at student performance and using that information then to plan instruction.
Right. And just like a phonics screener and word reading and spelling, those kinds of things, dictation, they all fall in the same category in that respect. So when we're considering the signs that a student might need a little more explicit phonemic awareness support beyond kindergarten and first grade, what are some things that we may notice?
Okay, so the signs that students might need a little more instruction in phonemic awareness beyond first grade. We know that reading difficulties are distributed on a continuum, right? From very severe to very mild. So same thing about phonemic awareness challenges. Some will be very mild and impact reading far down the road, and others will be much more obvious and impact reading early on. But after first grade, what you're looking for is you're looking for the student who may have difficulty learning phonics. You might think that the phonics isn't really sticking for them. A student who has difficulty with spelling words phonetically. So in their misspellings, they leave out sounds. Leaving out vowels is a huge sign specifically, but any sounds that they leave out of words would indicate that they're having some issues with the underlying sequence of sounds within the word and processing that. And then much later on, students who misread multisyllabic words habitually, right? So if they're reading a 3-syllable word, they read the beginning and they read the end, but they leave out the middle part. Those are students who are not fully alphabetic at the multi-syllable word level, and they might also have some phonemic awareness issues that are more mild, but are nonetheless putting a little sand in their reading system, a little unwanted interference with their reading processes.
Yeah, there's not as much clarity on the inner workings of a word. And I'm thinking to students in the past I've had who say Pacific for specific. And while those kinds of mix-ups are very cute when a child is 2 years old, when you're in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, that can be a sign of some phonological deficits that we certainly want to address.
Yeah, so you raise a great point there. Any type of articulation difficulty is going to make a student more vulnerable to also having phonemic awareness issues. Not necessarily, but the chances are good. So if there's a child who has any type of artic challenge, then that is a student who should be assessed for phonemic awareness.
Yeah, that's great. And then for a classroom teacher versus perhaps a reading interventionist, how do they make instructional decisions on which students would benefit most from this type of instruction? Or how do we know when to pull away from training the oral tasks to build that phoneme proficiency rather than just letting the act of reading and the act of spelling build those phonemic awareness skills?
Oh, this is such a great question. When you don't see the reading act happening the way you want to see it. So students who are misreading, students who are guessing words based on context, We already mentioned the dysphonetic spelling. All of those issues, students who have difficulty reading non-words on a screener, all of those issues point to a likelihood of underlying phonemic awareness challenges that are going to need a little instruction. Now, the good news is that once you identify those phonemic awareness issues and you teach to them, they are amazingly easy to teach to. Kids really respond to this instruction, and it's not terribly complex instruction either. It's fairly easy to plan if you're using blank tokens and spoken words, and you can get a lot of success. And so what can happen is you can be teaching phonics, and it just doesn't seem to be sinking in for that student. And that is partially because that foundation of phonological awareness, that foundation of clear, crisp sequences of speech sounds is not there for that student. So then when you go to map letters onto it, it just doesn't work well. So the letter sound relationships are not sticking. Another one that's kind of obvious, but I really wanted to mention it, is if you look at a student and you say, and the student looks at you and smiles and says, that student has a phonemic awareness issue. So that's a more basic level of just phoneme repetition.
Yeah, I love how you talked about this concept of remembering words and alluding to the orthographic mapping process too, because certainly kids can get by with phonetic decoding, but there comes a point when words are multisyllabic, multimorphemic, just very long, and plugging through every single letter string very slowly and laboriously is not an efficient way to lift the words off the page. So we do need to have a little bit more proficiency here with our phonemic awareness so that we can remember these words and we can store them in our brain for that instant automatic retrieval.
And that is such an important point. So phonics rests on a foundation of strong letter knowledge, the alphabetic principle, and phonemic awareness. So you need that foundation to teach the phonics. And the point of teaching phonics is not so students can sound out the word dog. The point of teaching phonics is so students have the skills to read new multisyllabic words independently when they get to fourth grade. So this is a long road. We don't want to underestimate the task based on what our little decodable texts look like in kindergarten and first grade. This is a long road that has many layers to it, especially in English. And sometimes building word recognition is completely blocked. You're absolutely right. So these students can decode, but they're not decoding automatically. And that is interfering. It's not giving them enough time to automatically store those words so they can be instantly recognized later.
Yeah. Perhaps maybe we can jump into the guide and you can answer some questions that the guide addresses. And I know there was a previous version, a guide for teaching phonemic awareness for 2023, and then you came out with the 2024 version with a few important updates. And I know one of them was you brought some instructional routines to the forefront of the guide, which I thought was really helpful to support teacher implementation. And another was also responding to language variation and pronunciation differences that we may see across dialects. So would you like to briefly speak to some of those revisions?
Sure. We do our best to create the guide and run it by people who have read it and they work in the classroom every day and find it useful, and we take their feedback. And then after it comes out, there's always some event, like someone passes it to their daughter who is a new teacher. And then we get the real feedback, which is like, I don't know, why does all this matter to me? Why are the routines in the back? And then we think, why are the routines in the back? And then we move them to the front for the next edition. And so that's how that happened, just to make those more salient for teachers. So if you want to learn more, you want to read more, you can go on beyond those. Those instructional routines, which are particularly targeted at interventionists, teachers find those very helpful. So now let's turn to the piece about dialect. And so when we think about dialect, we can think about it in terms of students who speak African American English, which is really prevalent. We can think about students who have other dialects, like a Southern dialect. And these adaptations apply for all of these students. It's just very important that we create an accepting environment for all of our students' spoken language. And so what that means with PA is, I think many times, because we are focused on articulation, well-meaning teachers want to correct, like the pronunciation of a particular sound, or like in AAE dialect, the last sound in a final blend might not be pronounced. And so we might want to correct. And what we don't always realize is what that does is it is implicitly a criticism of the student's home language. So that makes the student disengage from the task. And that is not what we want. We want to encourage and support the increased engagement of these students. And so it's just really important to think about how we allow students to participate in the task, focusing on the sequencing of the phonemes that are in their speech stream, maybe not in our speech stream, but in their speech stream. And this is true for students who have artic difficulties as well. If they pronounce r as w, then we're going to accept that word with the way that they are used to articulating that sound. So it's about meeting students where they are and honoring that in order to help them grow their phonemic awareness.
That's beautiful. And I always appreciate when people speak to celebrating a student's linguistic heritage. And we want to honor all of the linguistic skills that they're bringing to the table. And it's not a deficit that they speak a variation of English. It's actually an asset that they have even more skills to bring to the table. When I think about particular scenarios, like for example, if a teacher says to segment the sounds in bath, and then a student would say bath, bath. And they did it correctly, right? They have 3 sounds and they segmented the sounds. It's just one of the sounds may be different, but that's not a phonological error. It is just how that word is represented in their home language. And you gave an example about sometimes words with a final consonant blend, one of the sounds are left off. So for example, in the word blast, say they would go blast, b-l-as, and they leave off the t. What would be your recommendation in that case in terms of teacher talk?
You could try something like, that is one way to say the word. Here is another way. Say blast, and the student says blast. Good. Now say blast again slowly and count the sounds.
Yeah, and you're affirming that they're not wrong. They were correct. Mm-hmm. And we're going to offer an alternative to expand your linguistic skills. That's wonderful. So maybe you want to share with us one of your routines in the guide that is helpful for teaching phonemic awareness in action?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go to one specific part of a routine, focusing on scaffolds like Alconin boxes and chips or markers. So many teachers are familiar with using Alconin boxes. Those are those blank boxes that you put out to indicate to students how many sounds are in the word. And this can be a very effective scaffold, but it's also a huge scaffold. And so it is important to remove that over time so that students are counting those sounds for themselves. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. The second thing I wanted to mention is sometimes people ask, well, why are there, in our cover illustration and in our back examples, there are 2 colors of chips? And why are there 2 colors? Why aren't they all the same color, or why aren't they all different colors? And many phonemic awareness intervention programs, such as Linda Mood Bell, use different colors for the different sounds. And I can see how that would be very important. It also takes a lot of training to be able to do that and a lot of attention on the student's part. For classroom use and for intervention use that has been effective for my teaching anyway, even with very severely dyslexic students, I like to use these 2 colors, one for consonants and one for vowels. So the first thing it allows me to do is to explain the articulatory difference between consonants and vowels, which I think is fundamental for students to understand. So consonants are produced with the mouth closed, and they're produced with your lips, tongue, or teeth. And then I give some examples, and that's going to be our green chip. And then our orange chip, those are going to be the vowels. And vowels are produced with the mouth open and with continuous breath. So I can say, ah, or ah, and those are our vowel sounds. Then when you come back to teach syllables, every syllable has a core vowel sound. The vowel is the core of the syllable. So why use two colors and not just have all the chips be the same color? Well, it allows students to process that consonant vowel pattern. And almost as importantly, it allows a classroom teacher to see if you're working on words with initial blends and you're mixing those 4-sound words with 3-sound words. If you're at that point, when students lay out their chips at their desk, you can automatically see if they are detecting that blend because you're going to see 2 green chips at the beginning of the word. And it's super easy to process who might need more help and who is doing fine. So those are a couple techniques.
That's really helpful. And I love the idea of having that visual representation to note that the consonants are one color, the vowel sounds are another color. And in your guide, you talk a lot about multimodal opportunities to practice. And that's a wonderful scaffold for students and also for teachers, just a wonderful at a glance way to see they got it or they didn't get it. So maybe now we can get into some of the controversy around phonemic awareness that you also address in the guide. And perhaps we can start with deletion and substitution. In recent years, a lot of people will recommend only teaching blending and only teaching segmenting because they directly correct to reading and to spelling. But the guide still recommends tapping into deletion and substitution, and especially for our readers who are struggling and those with phonological core deficit. So how would you address this disconnect in some of the things that we hear out in the research world?
I think it's a misunderstanding between PA tasks that support strategic, intentional processes like decoding and spelling, and PA tasks that support automatic processing for fast, automatic aspects of reading, like orthographic mapping. And so teaching blending and segmenting is so important. And whatever grain size you're working at, those are the first tasks that you're going to practice with a student, blending and segmenting tasks. And those are good because once they can do that, it's very helpful, right, for being able to decode words and spell words. And you can also see how being able to decode and spell words would help them be able to blend and segment. But then we get to the other level. What about the bridge from decoding to automatic word recognition? And we know that that occurs through a self-teaching process and orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping is the automatic cognitive process that allows students to, after they've read the word, go back and map the sounds to the letters and then store it again to be recognized instantly later on. So in order for that to happen, your phonological processing has to be fast. So it's not enough to be accurate, it's got to be fast. So if a student can do deletion, what that means is that they're saying the word, then they're breaking apart the articulatory sounds, then they're pulling one sound out of that sequence, and then they're squishing it together again to come up with a new word. Well, that's a lot of manipulation. And that's why that word manipulation is in the research definition of PA. Because if you can do all of that, and you can do it quickly, that's a sign that your phonological processing is sufficiently developed to support further growth in reading.
Yeah. And as you're saying this, I'm thinking to even Scarborough's reading rope and how phonological awareness and decoding are 2 different strands of the rope. And the whole point is to weave them together. Mm-hmm. And I'm also thinking about word chaining, sound chaining. Like a lot of teachers are using this routine in their practices, and something like a word chain is highly supported by research. And yet it's not just blending and segmenting.
Correct.
So another point of contention that we hear about phonemic awareness is whether or not it should be taught with letters. So the guide emphasizes a use of tokens first and oral routines first before letters. And at the same time, some researchers highlight that phonemic awareness is more important with letters or more effective with letters. So can you clarify also the guide's stance here and how you would address the National Reading Panel's term of the use with letters?
Let's go to the controversy in the field. I think it's important to remember that everyone wants to advocate for the most effective instruction. Our perspective just depends on where we look for our evidence and how we weight that evidence. For some researchers, the NRP finding of a larger effect for teaching letters is convincing evidence, and that's all they need to see. Authors of the guide, though, are mindful of the NRP report warning, and this is a quote, that the conclusions drawn about letters in PA, for example, should be regarded as tentative and suggestive rather than the final word. And you can find that on page 220 of the NRP report in the first paragraph. In addition to that little caveat from the NRP, we also note that there was no letters effect in the NRP until the studies with reading disabled students were removed. And they discuss that on page 221 in the second column in the third paragraph. Authors and reviewers of the guide bring extensive experience teaching students who struggle with reading. So this omission is really important to us. This experience indicates that PA can be developed very efficiently by using blank tokens that provide support. When struggling readers do not know the correct letter sounds, teaching PA by using letters can increase their cognitive load and overwhelm them. So we've seen that PA taught orally with tokens should be a few minutes at the start of a structured literacy lesson, and it can be very effective in that way. And the last point that informs our perspective that we articulate in the guide is that meta-analyses are one piece of evidence, but they're correlational in nature. And because they're correlational in nature, it has a bunch of implications for how these studies are interpreted that are kind of complex and really beyond the scope of this podcast. It is interesting to note that one recent meta-analysis by Rice and colleagues in 2022 also didn't find a difference between teaching PA with letters and without letters in terms of how far PA instruction developed. So that's my perspective. In contrast, researchers who advocate teaching PA with letters are looking at evidence from typical students at the start of their literacy journey. And I think there is some pretty persuasive research that says that teaching PA and connecting it to letters is very effective for pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade students, right? You have all of those Burns studies. You have a couple of meta-analyses that say that. Wonderful. The thing that becomes a challenge is with this definition of what does with letters mean. Because many of these PA programs that are being tested spend a long time with oral PA work first and then transition to instruction with letters. Not all of them, but many of them. That was certainly true in the NRP report. So really the conclusion of the NRP report is that oral-only phonemic awareness works well to improve reading and spelling, and oral phonemic awareness instruction with letters also works really well to improve reading and spelling. And that is about what we can say really at this point with confidence. So now it comes down to looking at the student in front of you. If your student is 4 or 5 and they are at the beginning of their literacy journey, then by all means illustrate that alphabetic principle for them. On the other hand, there is an argument to be made for giving students some space, especially initially. This is another thing many people don't note, is that many of the studies in kindergarten didn't start until January or March of kindergarten. So while students are learning their letters, it might be good to go ahead and not hold back on your phonemic awareness instruction, but do your phonemic awareness instruction using Move It and Say It the way Blackman did with the blank tokens. And then connecting it to letters as students become more comfortable with the letters in order to illustrate the alphabetic principle. So you see how I covered the whole magic triangle there? PA, letter knowledge, and connecting the two in the alphabetic principle. Older students are a different story. Older students are convinced that reading is about visual memorization. They are not paying attention to sound. You can see that in their spellings because their spellings are dysphonetic and their misreads are dysphonetic. So they are not attending to sound. It's like trying to develop a discrete skill. If I'm trying to learn how to cast on while I'm knitting, I'm not going to be knitting 7 sweaters to learn how to cast on. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to practice casting on for a little bit every day until I get really good at it. And that's the equivalent of in PA. So it's important to give those students the space to work orally to develop that skill. Now, do younger students also need that space? Well, that space is a great place to play games in. It's a great way to make PA classroom instruction accessible for all your students, because as soon as you start putting letters in there, some students are going to be ready for it and other students are not. And so it's a nice, inclusive way to create a little PA space every day that all kids can participate in.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really nice and thorough explanation. And I think it really shows you the nuance in how instruction can look different depending on the students in front of you. And not everything that we hear out there can be accepted as a blanket statement for all learners in all scenarios all of the time. And we really need to be responsive to the students in front of us. And instruction may look different in those types of scenarios that you explained so nicely. And I also appreciate that the guide talks about also the nuance in the word with. When you look it up in the dictionary, with can carry different meanings depending on the context it's being used. And I can eat dinner with a fork and I can eat dinner with my husband. And one is being used as an actual tool and one is being accompanied by. And so that term of phonemic awareness with letters, when we take a look at the studies that are being used in that category, it is accompanied by, not necessarily always a tool as. And so we need to take that into consideration. Like, of course, we're going to tie it into print. No one is saying to do oral only tasks for 20 minutes and never attaching it to a reading activity. That would be disjointed. And the point is not to teach in silos, but to have this integrated piece. But there is still value in having the oral piece there.
I completely agree. And I want to thank you for highlighting that. I don't think that anyone in the field believes that PA should be taught without accompanying phonics instruction. And there are several places in the guide where we explicitly state that it is one part of a structured literacy lesson. I think the debate can center around how integrated should it be. And again, the first question when people start talking about reading, the first question in your mind should be, well, who are they talking about specifically? Young readers, readers with difficulty, typical readers, older readers. So asking that who question can sometimes be clarifying.
Yeah, definitely. It'll answer a lot of the follow-up questions there. And so for critics out there who might say that the guide isn't aligned with the latest research because there are recent meta-analyses out there, what would you have to say about those kinds of conversations?
I think that those are really important conversations to have, and there are ways to have them. But to more concretely address that, let's think about how the guide is produced. So the guide comes out in 2024. That means the revision has been underway for a year before that. Sometimes we are aware of all the literature that's out there. Sometimes we're not. So I did go back and I did look at some of the studies. At the time, I think our take was that there is not enough evidence from the meta-analyses to say that there should be a shift in the field. And I'm going to continue to stand by that. Is there some initial evidence? Yes, there is. So, for example, we have the Rehfeld paper, which found of all the effects that they looked at in one area, which was the composite, PA taught using letters for 2 children who had suspected reading disabilities resulted in stronger gains. Another meta-analysis, the NRP report, did not find that. So now we have 2 different findings. We do not have convergence. We have 2 different findings from meta-analyses. The Stalega and colleagues, what did they find? Well, they looked at studies with pre-K and maybe kindergarten students, and they found that when you teach PA orally with no letters involved, no phonics, not connected, it still impacts reading down the road. But if you teach PA and you teach phonics, you get a better effect on reading. Okay, well, that's important to know. That's confirmatory evidence of things that we have already known. You're always going to get a better bang for your buck with reading and spelling when you are also including phonics, because reading and spelling include letters. So that's what that study says. Well, that wasn't really our concern because we don't believe in oral only instruction that is never connected to letters or phonics. That is not a position that we hold. Now, that's a position that that paper stated that we hold, but it is not a position that is actually held, as people can see when they read the guide. So these are just examples of how we can go through these different meta-analyses and think about them in deeper ways and really consider, is this shifting our practice? Is this sufficient to shift our practice or not? And right now, our answer is it is not sufficient evidence to shift our practice. And that's the way it plays out for now.
Right, right. And then when we think about different types of research studies out there, there has never been an experimental study comparing 2 groups of students and one receiving oral phonemic awareness and one receiving phonemic awareness that is using letters as an instrument, and with that as the only variable comparing those 2 groups.
Actually, they are very few and far between. All of these intricacies, which I am fascinated by, and Dr. Kilpatrick can explain so clearly, we don't have room for those in the guide. Right. In the guide, we're trying to get it as concise and to the point as possible. And so there are some gaps there. There are some shortcomings, as there are in any document. And it is a living and growing document. And I appreciate the feedback that people contribute to it.
I appreciate your tip of the hat to trying to be a concise document for teachers as well and user-friendly. And it's not meant to be a huge book that is difficult to digest with every single scenario and every single tidbit of information, but just the most practical information moving forward for your instruction. And you talked a bit about how science happens as well. So how are teachers supposed to navigate scenarios like this when it appears that new findings are perhaps conflicting with older ones? And before you even mentioned that it might be 10 years until we have more concrete evidence to instruct our decisions.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So the key phrase that I heard in what you said is the appearance that new findings are conflicting with older ones. So it is very important to understand that in the science of reading and in science in general, there are very few exceptions in the entire history of science where things flip like that. Very few exceptions. You can count them on less than 5 fingers. So the way science progresses is you have this phase where we're trying to find out information like, is it better to connect PA to letters or not, and with whom? And you have all these different studies coming out, and this study says one thing, and this other study says another thing, and then they manipulate it differently, and then they see this finding or they see that finding. It's very messy. There's a lot of disagreement. And then over time, the number of experimental studies and quasi-experimental studies accumulates. And then you can see that there is a clear convergence of a pattern. And guess what that almost always is in cognitive psychology? The answer is almost always that both are true. And it comes down to whom and in what conditions. And so that's very important for everybody to remember who is in this debate. So what teachers can do is, first of all, just breathe. We have a lot of studies that show if you teach with letters or you teach without letters in your PA, as long as you're connecting it to a structured literacy curriculum and building the alphabetic principle, your students are going to be fine. Now it's a matter of working with the student in front of you. If you're trying to do intervention for a particular student, if letters is confusing them or they don't know the sounds that many letters make, if you're finding that using letter tiles is an incredible burden in planning your lessons because you have to select every item so that it only includes the letter sounds that students know and then give them a letter tile bag that has those letters in it, if that's burdensome to you, then you can do oral practice with blank tokens, and that will help provide them with the memory supports that they need. And occasionally ask them, that is sound, what letter would you use for that is sound? And that's what we mean when we say a sprinkling of letters. So as a teacher, think about your context. What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to accomplish? Who is the student in front of you and how are you responding? And let that guide your work.
Yeah, that was well stated and really helpful. And teachers want to do right by kids, and now they're afraid they're doing things wrong. And we have this adage of knowing better and doing better. And so people want to shift instructional practices to make sure that they're doing better. But it's also important to understand the underlying skills needed for reading to occur in the brain. And I think that's a huge factor of this work in knowing what's needed to get a child reading proficiently, and what do we need to do as teachers to help foster those skills so that they become automatic. And it may look different in different scenarios, and to be mindful of that. And for teachers trying to discern this information in the research world, what's perhaps maybe the simplest and clearest message that you want them to hear in today's conversation?
Try to always teach your new PA tasks with tokens. And try to always teach your PA by having the student begin by repeating the word. Because whether you're using oral-only activities or activities that connect to letters, if students are not repeating the word, you are not working in depth enough on that PA and you're sacrificing progress. So the student should always repeat the word. And when they're trying to do the PA tasks, those tasks are solved based on their articulation of the word, not based on what they hear. So the cue is, what is the first sound you said in sit? Say the word sit, and they say sit. What was the first sound you said? So always drawing their attention back to the articulation. For students who are more advanced, who can do it in a snap, it's totally fine. But about half the kids are really going to need that explicit connection to articulation.
And it all goes back to orthographic mapping as well. If we don't have that pronunciation in our brains, can't remember it. And then if you can give teachers one non-negotiable about phonemic awareness, what would it be?
Do not let a lack of certainty about the details stop you from teaching PA. However you teach it, PA is a necessary part of reading and spelling development.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ashby, this has been such a wonderful and insightful conversation. I'm so grateful for you taking the time out of your day to explain a lot of the information out there that we see circulating around phonemic awareness and going into depth about your PA guide. So where can listeners connect with you further or reach out if they have further questions around phonemic awareness instruction?
Yeah, feel free to put my Gmail in the show notes. We can do that, as well as a link to the guide.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michelle. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.